Because Māori are still very adamant that it's a slippery slope. If you go down, if you make a decision towards commodification, where you stop. And we're going through a very huge issue in New Zealand, as with many other countries, on privatisation of water. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to work with some conservation or some environmental organisations to challenge the government's view on the privatisation of water. And we've just recently had the pronouncement of a recognition of a river as having the status of a person, which is a long direction. Which is pretty, when you think of the current political landscape in New Zealand, it's pretty amazing that we can get to that stage of recognising that a river has the status of personhood. But it's only when environmentalists work together, not against, but work together with Indigenous peoples that you can come up with these really innovative approaches that are good for the community, but they're actually good for the whole country. And how we get more trust is something that all of us have to work at, but I'm firmly of the belief that it's the only answer. Because if we continue to hope that it's governments who are going to take these actions, we've seen they're on the wrong path. So it's really up to us.
Some very strong messages and I think some good guidance from our Indigenous speakers. We're now going to hear about where we are now from Janice Elkhorn, who's going to give us an overview of mechanisms that are in place to respect Indigenous rights, and then we'll hear from Kristen Walker and Gina Cosentino about where their conservation organizations, what they're doing in this area. I'd like to ask you to be thinking about, for the discussion period, what kind of direction would you give to conservation organizations, including the IUCN, about where we go in terms of improving relationships between Indigenous communities and conservation organizations?
Janice.
Thank you, Katie. I just want to bring us quickly back to remember the sort of international law basis that exists as a founding for thinking about renewing a respectful relationship between conservation organizations and Indigenous peoples in particular places. Of course, there is the UNDRIP, the ILO 169, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Cultural, Economic, and Social Rights, and very importantly, the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. All of these should be grounding our relationships with each other. There's a lot of, it's easier to go forward sometimes than just to sort of deal with the past problems, but you have to deal with the past problems in order to build a trusting relationship. So what kind of redress mechanisms are there for these past issues? There's, of course, the International Human Rights Courts. If you haven't seen it, the Organization for American States in the Americas has the strongest guidance. In 2009 and 2010, they produced a compendium of the jurisprudence of all of the cases where they on international law application of Indigenous people's rights. It's really a great publication. You can get it. It's in Spanish, English, maybe French, but mostly in Spanish and English. And it's at the OAS site. You can invite the UN Human Rights Special Rapporteur to investigate and write a report. But his visit creates no binding changes. It just puts out a report. Recently, within the past couple of years, he visited conservation-related problems in Guatemala, Paraguay, Nepal, and Kenya. It's more of a stopgap solution to reduce tensions and to bring the parties back to the table rather than coming to some kind of conclusion. There's an option for an ombudsman or some sort of independent inspection mechanism. This has been brought up several times. There's no action been taken on that. Theoretically, it would be based in the United Nations Convention on Indigenous Issues. There's no place to register cases, only the complaints. It's just, there's no counting, no sense of how big the problem is. In Durban in 2003, at the World Parks Conference, there was this recommendation that there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was put forward in Bangkok for study, but there was no action taken. The most recent, and it's come forward now, is the Wakatani mechanism. If you came to the session last night, you know about that. But it's really just a dialogue mechanism that can be invited to your place to help sort out an immediate problem. Probably the most effective mechanisms are those that have been established at the country levels in particular places at the initiative of Indigenous peoples, rather than at the initiative of the conservation side. For example, in Peru, the Indigenous organization IDESEP stepped forward and really engaged in the development of the RED plan for Peru. And there was a decision made that there would be an Indigenous peoples mesa, convening space just for Indigenous peoples, because the other space was dominated by the NGOs. So there's sort of two parallel discussion spaces at this point there. But that's an Indigenous initiative. And I'm sure you can all think of many more places. So there isn't sort of a nice external international mechanism that you can bring in. The main pathway available for Indigenous peoples now to engage with conservation going forward is using rights-based approaches to negotiate plans. And there's a new conservation initiative on human rights, which my colleagues may talk about. There's 7 organizations engaged in it since 2009. In 2010, the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights made a presentation to the UN Commission on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and talked about how they really wanted to work in a more transparent and accountable mechanism. They created a common reporting framework and reports for each organization to improve their activities to improve their rights-based approaches. And they made plans, work plans for 2011. There's a website, but so far it doesn't seem that there's any sort of accounting for whether the plans are implemented. It's kind of hanging there. So you might watch this website and see where this goes. And I'll turn this over to you, Alex.
Hello, my name is Kristen Walker-Pionia. I work at Conservation International, and I oversee our social policy and practice program. I'd also like to introduce Johnson Serda, who's in the back. Raise your hand there, Johnson. He's actually overseeing our Indigenous and Traditional Peoples program. Thanks, Janice, for giving an introduction to the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, which will allow me to skip over a number of slides in the interest of time. But as Janice said, the conservation organizations came together several years ago to discuss some of the issues we were dealing with and how, as institutions, we should be able to come together and look at these issues and improve the work that we're doing related to human rights. So it took a lot of discussion and debate to figure out how to do that, and it took a lot of discussion how to come up with a set of common principles that we can all work towards. So we have, and I'm going to be very simple at the moment because I actually want to talk about what CI is doing to move forward. But we've agreed in terms of principles to respect human rights, promote human rights within our conservation organizations, protect the vulnerable, encourage good governance. So they're the principles by which we are moving forward as an institution, but more importantly than just having a set of principles is the agreement that we've made to move forward in terms of implementation. That all of the institutions have agreed to establish relevant institutional policies, ensure the implementation of those policies is in place. You know, one is to have a policy, but a policy is only as good as the practice that goes with it. So the institutions have all agreed to do that. And then how to address the links between human rights and conservation within the design and implementation and monitoring of the victim of the conservation programs. And monitoring across conservation is always a challenge. You know, we see the new program will work with IUCN. CI has a new mission. Our community is making more more and more with the development community. And how do we learn from the development community? How do we learn from our Indigenous partners to be able to monitor more effectively and engage? We've also discussed accountability measures. How do we become more accountable? Jan has highlighted we have a website, and we're in the process of trying to get 8 institutions to get all of their reporting in to do that. So that will be up shortly in the next round of reporting of the progress. And then how do we apply principles with our partners? We give out a lot of grants. We support various types of organizations, but how does that carry from an institution like Conservation International to a grantee, to a partner to do that? And so all of this takes dialogue, discussion, creativity, and innovation. So with that said, and Gina Constantino will present on TNC, I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach that CI has taken. After signing on to the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, we continue to work to consolidate a lot of our efforts and how, as an institution, we were going to look at a rights-based approach. We have had a specific focus over the last 10 years on creating an Indigenous and traditional peoples program, listening to the dialogue, engaging in policy fora that conservation organizations had not engaged in before. We had never gone to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. We had never tracked some of these issues related to the CED. So CI, from our experience in engaging in these environments, was an educational process for the entire institution. When we began the Indigenous program, I remember sitting in meetings, and it was always, this was Kristen's issue. This was Kristen's issue. And it wasn't. It was an institutional issue. Now you don't see that. Now you see a transformation that we have Indigenous partners at the table. We're talking about design. No thing is perfect, and it's still working. But taking the work that we've done with our Indigenous partners and having dialogues and understanding what some of the issues were, and understanding what we do on the ground and how that connects to national, regional, and global policy. It's something that many of the institutions, and I'll speak for my own, had not done before, and we're doing that. There was a question in the side event that we had yesterday about power and how you balance that. And part of this process that CI has taken on with our Indigenous and Traditional Peoples program is how do we help, and as Loretta pointed out, accompany our Indigenous partners both on the ground, but in policy fora, where we need to share information, share skills, understand positions, and be able to support those processes. So building on that experience, CI has worked to integrate a rights-based approach, and we looked at what has come out of IUCN in terms of looking at those issues and how we need to think about it. And we need to look at a set of norms and standards and principles, and then we need to actually put it into our policy planning, implementation, and outcomes assessment. This is a work in progress across IUCN, but it's how do our own membership internalize these pieces and do that. So we went through a process. We had to educate our staff on what were human rights. And I know that this is a very big framework here, but we had to ground this in the vision that CI has, in the mission, and in our values. Because it's there. But part of it was helping to educate our staff that we look and deal with these issues on a daily basis, but we don't always recognize it. So we pulled together our staff from across the institution, from human resources to our field programs, and we brought in human rights experts to talk to us. We even did it with our leadership team, so to make sure there was a better understanding about how we as an institution could improve our practices, but also have a rights-based approach. So you'll see the principles that I just highlighted with the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights are there, but we also added one, and it's to work in partnership. We can't do anything by ourselves. We can't do certain things by ourselves. We need our Indigenous partners, we need our local partners, we need advocacy groups to work with us on certain set of issues. So this is the framework by which we have been working. And then we've taken that beyond. So one is to have the policies. We needed as an institution to look at our internal policies and key social issues related to these policies. Where are we going with our new mission? We are looking for more and more accountability with human well-being. And how does that relate to our policies? So we have the policies and how do you put that into practice? We need a set of tools. We need good practices. We need protocols. We need to understand what common frameworks we have with our Indigenous partners, but also with local communities and multiple stakeholders. And then how are we accountable to that? We're doing a lot of work on climate change issues. One of the other speakers says there's many roundtables being set up related to climate change at the national level. But how is it actually being accountable? In Peru, we worked on a stakeholder engagement assessment process. You know, it's great to form these roundtables. It's great to say you have Indigenous representation. It's great to say you have local community representation. But what wasn't happening is that you didn't know who was actually attending those meetings. So how can you help work with local partners, but also governments, to understand just because they create a roundtable and check off a box, it's not necessarily fulfilling the needs that were actually articulated. So how can we as an institution think creatively to help push those issues related to power and make sure there's a more active process? You know, so we're looking at all these issues. We're looking at how, within our own institution, we do a rights-based approach, how we interact with all of the social safeguards issues we have, related to the multilateral bilaterals, related to the new mechanisms being developed. How do we engage with multiple stakeholders? We don't deal in a stagnant situation. We deal with multiple stakeholders, multiple sets of issues, and how do we facilitate those processes? And then how do we value, how do we see the various components that different cultures bring to the table? Their knowledge systems, their connection with the land. So that's really important. And what is the overall impact of conservation on human well-being? It can be positive, and potentially be negative. So these are some of the things that we're grappling with institutionally. It is a process. And we'll never say it's perfect, but we are doing our best to be able to move that forward and engage with partners. I want to jump in a little bit to what we're doing specifically with Indigenous peoples. You know, when we talk about Durban, that happened almost 10 years ago, there was a lot of contention between conservation organizations and Indigenous groups. And there was a huge debate. Many of the conservation organizations ran into rooms and were afraid to discuss and talk. So we had to get out there. We had to get out there, we had to start listening. Listening and understanding, not just talking. So I myself spent a lot of times in meetings listening and hearing and trying to engage, trying to figure out which way we need to go. What I heard is we needed to see better representation within conservation organizations of Indigenous peoples. So it took a process, but we formed an Indigenous advisory group that helps to advise us on our work with Indigenous people. It helps to advise us on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We also heard that we needed to see better representation on our board of directors. We have 2 Indigenous representatives on our board of directors. The Italian corpus is participating, and Megan Ortiz from Brazil. From the Kayako on the board. They need to have a voice at the highest decision level of our institution. They need to be able to debate issues because we're dealing with all types of actors. We also heard that Indigenous peoples wanted to understand how categories of protected areas are being done, how do you incorporate traditional knowledge, how do they put forth their own management systems. So we developed a fellowship program. It's still growing. My dream is to have a fellowship program that has 20 fellows per year. You know, right now we're 4, 5, and 6 fellows per year, but we're trying to help support Indigenous communities related to their own conservation plans, merge their knowledge with what is going on in terms of conservation. And we're seeing very positive outcomes. We also hear from Indigenous communities that we need to have joint capacity building efforts. One, as Florina highlighted, the issues around RED, understanding what comes to the communities, deciphering that, helping the communities interpret it, but also helping communities put that into their own language. We're also hearing from the Women's Biodiversity Forum as well, Indigenous women, that they need support because sometimes they're marginalized within their own communities and they're dealing with issues specifically related to traditional knowledge that they're trying to support them in their processes. We're also hearing at climate and CED COPs, there needs to be some discussion of technical capacity in terms of listening to financing mechanisms, listening to targets. How can a conservation organization help Indigenous peoples with those components? We got the NGOs together and said, okay, we're supporting different efforts. Let's join efforts in conjunction with some of the Indigenous caucuses to help provide orientation to a lot of discussions around policies. How do you actually engage in the financing discussion? How do you access your delegates? So part of that process is helping them. And in many cases, through some of the collaborations we have, we are now seeing Indigenous leaders on their delegations at the conventions. And that is extremely important and has a lot of influence and weight. So that's really an understanding how do you take their experience locally, and get it into the global forum and then take it back. We're looking at the collaboration of the development of policies. How can we help jointly develop policies to be able to move forward, making sure we're on the same page and the common agenda. And then also, how can we support Indigenous communities and organizations on their own work? We have Indigenous communities who have their own efforts. We have Indigenous organizations who are working to support the communities. We have Indigenous organizations who are working to support the policy level. How do we help through grants and helping them develop their own programs and work do that? Funds are limited, so we need to look at that issue. And then how do we directly engage on the ground? So improving those issues on the ground, having a common agenda from the beginning of any idea that comes to surface, and understanding what the communities want to do. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.